Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Michael Keays. Michael is a senior diplomatic fellow at the Wilson Center. His day job is as a full-time senior foreign service officer at the U.S. Department of State. He's wrapping up a year-long detail at the Wilson Center, working on a project tentatively titled Lessons Learned and Observations for When We Decide to Re-engage Russia. So, Michael, you're taking on a big question, and this is forward-looking thinking because there's no end in sight to the war as we see it currently.
That's correct. I would say that this is theoretical. I'm trying to be helpful to my colleagues at the State Department, having worked on Russia myself there and also Afghanistan and other kind of fast-paced issues at the department. I know oftentimes you've got really smart people over there putting out fires, right? And dealing with tasks as they come. And they don't get a lot of time to do a lot of creative thinking or to dig back through history. And so that's what I thought I could help out our team working on Russia by coming here and spending the year kind of working on this project to have something to hand over to them to be of potential use down the road.
How did you find that change of pace of looking far down the road while you're at the center versus putting out fires, as you put it?
Actually, very refreshing, and I'm very grateful for the State Department for allowing me to come over here, and for the Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center for providing me this space and all the resources that we have to do this research. And of course, you're surrounded by international and American scholars, each with their own unique projects that they're working on, and their backgrounds so that you can bounce ideas off of and everything. And that's very refreshing. I think I'm definitely going to treasure my year here, and I would definitely recommend it for any future, foreign service officer who's interested in doing this kind of thing.
Well, it's been terrific having you with us as well. I'm sorry that it's coming to a close. It seems like it's been a quick year in many ways. I guess for the sake of your comfort and the clarity of our viewers, we should let them know too, this is not official State Department policy, right? This is independent research, and you'll offer it to your colleagues for them to find whatever value they find in it. And that's in the spirit of the Wilson Center, where it's independent research owned by the scholar.
That's correct. In fact, very early on, I made it clear to anybody who talked with me about my project that this is a voluntary paper that's going to be delivered to the State Department, and it's going to be whether they want to use it or not, but it's essentially my own views, and it doesn't reflect necessarily U.S. government policy or the Wilson Center's views on things or the Kennan Institute's views on particular issues. They're my own views, and no one should construe anything in my paper or what I say here as any kind of change in policy.
A basic premise of your approach is, I think, if I understand this correctly, is that no matter the outcome, no matter what we think about Russia, we cannot ignore Russia.
That's correct. I mean, for a couple reasons. The first is that it can destroy us, right? I mean, it possesses a huge nuclear arsenal, and it has a large military with conventional weapons that are extremely destructive as well. So ideally, we would have a better relationship, maybe even a friendly one at some point, so that we don't have to worry about that. But in the meantime, our planners, our military planners, and our government thinkers, usually when we plan sort of on worst case scenario outcomes, or at least, what could go wrong. And in that case, we don't want to have any kind of miscalculation, misunderstanding, or mistake that's misinterpreted by either side, the U.S. side or the Russian side, when it comes to life or death issues. So I think on that basis alone, we need to have more communication with Russia, preferably to achieve some strategic stability in the world, maybe more than what we have now. There's also the reality that Russia, is a player in still diplomatically. It has a lot of support around the world. If it's not overt support, it's sort of quiet support from what we would call the global South. There are many countries that maybe privately don't necessarily agree with U.S. positions, and they like the idea that there are leaders from, say, Russia or the PRC who are willing to stand up to the U.S. So we can't rule that out. The Russians are in most major international organizations and regional organizations, and they have influence. Also, they are the largest country in the world, and they dominate the Eurasian continent, right? So they still have a lot of influence in the countries of Central Asia. They educated a lot of the people who live in those countries, especially people who are in decision-making positions. Um, so, and of course, they share the Asian continent with China. And so for these reasons alone, I think we need to respect Russia, and we need to engage it on the basis of its strengths and its capabilities, even if the capabilities haven't been fully harnessed.
So you're not in the business of making predictions, but you did have to look at various scenarios of how things may play out. Could you share with us some of the scenarios that you considered?
Sure. Very basically, I would say that the two sort of you know scenarios might be: is President Putin still in power, or is he not in power? Right? Because if we're going to engage Russia at some point in the future, even if it's 10 years from now, President Putin might still be in power. What the situation will be like on the ground in Ukraine or in Russia or in both places, we don't know what that's going to be like. But if President Putin's in power, then we have to think, if we're going to approach him in a certain way at a certain time, how's he likely to respond? And I think, generally speaking, the conventional view is that probably he wouldn't be too keen on engaging with us, especially if Russia has suffered significant losses and he hasn't been able to achieve his objectives in Ukraine, right? The other scenario might be somebody else in power, for instance. That person could be like Putin, or it could be someone totally different than Putin. In that case, I would assume that we would want to kind of test that person out. So, assuming the person agreed, let's go down this pathway and look at how we can re-engage one another. Then we would want to kind of test that person out, sort of under the principle of trust but verify, right? Maybe start out small, albeit on important issues like arms control, strategic stability, non-proliferation, things like that. And as we have wins and successes, I mean, for both of us, for both of our countries in those areas, then maybe we start broadening out into other areas of mutual interest. And there should be many with Russia.
So at least in the short term, we're not talking about anything that would look like full-blown normalization of relations.
No, I don't believe so, because just the scenario right now is just so bad. And I should point out that, obviously we condemn what Putin is doing in Ukraine. This is completely unnecessary, and it's brutal, and it's devastating. And one of the things that I believe we will have to explore with Russia is accountability for what happens and what happened and what's happening in Ukraine now, and that includes the issue of war crimes, and that's going to be very difficult, right? Especially if someone like President Putin is still in power.
So, Michael, I'm wondering if you mentioned security concerns and accountability, really sticky wickets. But there is cooperation, or there historically has been cooperation between Russia and the United States on other types of areas, whether it's Arctic exploration or the International Space Station. Do you see, is there a list of low-hanging fruit where, as we would optimistically look toward a world where there may be re-engagement, we could move more quickly on?
Yes, I would say if you go back to 1958, believe it or not, we signed some agreements with Russia on medical and science cooperation. Because these were agreements, they didn't have to be ratified by our Senate, so they didn't go through that whole process, nor the whatever process would be on the Soviet side. They were small. They were kind of modest efforts, but they built trust. They were generally built on professional relationships between Soviet and American scientists who already knew each other because of their professions. And naturally, our security services on both sides, theirs and ours, were closely monitoring, and the governments were closely monitoring what they were doing. But those things built the kind of trust which led to the détente period later on, right, where we saw cooperation in space as one of the high points. The Arctic is clearly one that where we have had cooperation prior to, say, 2014, and where we hopefully will continue to cooperate, maybe at the scientist to scientist level, because we have so many shared interests there. And Russia, of course, has the largest Arctic border of all the countries bordering the Arctic region. It has the greatest potential impact. So I think that's another area. And I would say agriculture would be an area where we really should look at cooperating, mainly because the whole eastern third of Russia contains some very fertile land and clean water, but the place is very sparsely populated. And so the Russians are having to bring the Chinese in now to farm their lands, and it would be better if they could farm their lands on their own. So that means building up their own capabilities to do that, building up an interest in their own agricultural sector. And I think the U.S. is a country that, and also Japan and the Republic of Korea are all three countries there who could work with Russia to develop their agricultural capabilities so that they're more self-sustaining and they consolidate their hold over that part of Russia.
Will your recommendations include urgency on the question of nuclear weapons or arms control in general? That international architecture is on life support at best. Tell us your thinking on that.
So there's a couple things. First of all, as you noted, I'd say life support's a good way of putting it. I mean, prior to 2014, we had all sorts of conventional arms control agreements like Open Skies, the Vienna document, the CFE treaty, that allowed us to see each other's conventional holdings. And that really builds a lot of trust. Since those things don't exist now, we don't really even know where these items are, and you're seeing the effects of that now in Ukraine. So that's really vital, and especially since now we have even far more powerful conventional weapons than we did back when the CFE treaty first came into existence. On the issue of nuclear weapons, I think the main thing here is not only do we need to sort of continue on the whole issue of sort of maybe slowing down development of nuclear capabilities, but even reducing our holdings. I think most people would agree that's a good idea. But also, the world has changed just even in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, we have more nuclear powers than we did when those agreements were made, the START Treaty and START 2. So we have a nuclear China now that's more capable than it used to be. We have the DPRK seems to have nuclear weapons. Iran certainly is getting closer every day towards obtaining a nuclear capability, and that's going to fuel a race in the Middle East and the Far East, other countries potentially hedging by developing their own nuclear programs. So the world has changed a lot, even prior to 2014, and so if we're going to engage Russia as the other main holder of nuclear weapons, then maybe we can not only work to reduce our holdings with them, but then maybe we can work with them to engage these other countries to have agreements that hold all of us accountable and bring all of our numbers down, so that we don't have so many nuclear weapons in the world and so many opportunities for disaster.
As you pondered the questions that you explored, Michael, tell us about the lessons of history that you incorporated into your thinking.
Yeah, so I basically wanted to look at what three models of engagement. So I looked at the Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission that occurred under Presidents Clinton and Yeltsin. Then I looked at the Bush-Putin dialogue that occurred under those two presidents. And then I looked at the bilateral presidential commission under Obama and Medvedev as various forms of engagement, either smaller or larger, more comprehensive or less comprehensive, right? To see what lessons we could learn sort of very practically from those modes of engagement. The other thing that was interesting was the way in which we reached out to, at that time, the Soviets. I mean, in the early 1980s, what I think a lot of people don't understand is that the late 70s and early 80s were very dangerous in the Cold War. There were lots of really bad things going on, proxy wars in Africa and Central America. The US felt that it had to intervene in Grenada in 1983 and the Caribbean. We had the Korean Airlines incident over the Pacific, where the Soviets shot down a civilian airliner, which included over 60 Americans and an American congressman, right? I mean, people died even during the so-called Cold War. People were dying, and it was very dangerous. And so President Reagan and his Secretary of State, Schultz, had real foresight to think about how can we bring stability to the international situation. And they started sort of behind the scenes communications with Ambassador Dobrynin in the US, which eventually led to the 1985 Geneva summit with Gorbachev, who was a relatively new leader in the Soviet Union at that time. And that started the whole ball rolling from that time forward. Why do I point that out? Because the world was very dangerous, kind of like the way it is now. And yet we had brave, visionary leaders who were willing to take risks to try to improve the situation. Of the three different commissions or sort of ways in which we engaged Russia, starting with the Gorbachev and Mirgin Commission, I think the main thing there to take away from those is the understanding that even during periods of goodwill where you have maybe interagency teams on both sides who are really trying to engage with one another to move various balls down the field on issues of mutual concern, you're going to have detractors from both sides, people who are suspicious about the intentions of the other side and who are going to try to throw spokes in the wheels and stop things from going forward for whatever reason. It may be domestic politics, it may be genuine suspicion. And so that's going to be one of the things that both sides, if and when we decide to re-engage, are going to be having to deal with again. We're going to have to convince our own publics of the need to be doing this.
No straight lines in life or in diplomacy. I guess it's just the way it is. So let me ask you also, speaking of history, more personal history, you did 2 tours of duty in Russia, correct? And you've dealt with Russian diplomats beyond that many times. What did that personal experience, how did that factor into your analysis?
So the mid 90s were a period of relative optimism, and we were working with Russian diplomats on global issues and regional issues of concern, including arms control and non-proliferation, and also peace in the Middle East. I mean, I worked with Russian diplomats who were real experts on the Middle East region, and oftentimes they were dealing with uh, their counterparts in the region were the opposites of the people we were dealing with, right? So if we were very close with the Israelis, they were very close with the Palestinians. These are the kinds of things that fueled the Cold War, but also gave the Russians the ability to actually, once they changed their approach and their goals, right, actually help move Middle East peace forward. So that's again, if anything, it reinforced, right, the idea that it's better to have the Russians working with us and us working with them on issues of mutual interest than to be constantly confronting them and therefore contributing to global insecurity. I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is I think I came away having lived in that country for 5 years, in 2 years in the mid 90s and 3 years in the Russian Far East in Vladivostok, 2016 to 2019, really came away with the idea that it sounds kitschy, but it's true. I mean, most normal human beings want the same things in life. They want some relative peace and stability, a little bit of predictability in life, and the opportunities and chances to make the best of their situations. You know, Russians maybe expect more from their government and maybe want their government to do more for them, and they're willing to trade away a little bit of their own personal freedom for that. Than say Americans were rather hyper individualistic in terms of a culture. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of Americans and a lot of Russians could get around a table and probably we'd see eye to eye on like 80% of the things in our lives and in the world. So it's just an unfortunate dynamic that it's not only people, right,
Right.
that determine what a country does in the world. It's largely the governments and elected governments, or governments that come to power themselves and do what they want. And that's what we diplomats have to do then, is we have to try to make sure that our governments are responsive to our own peoples, and avoid conflicts between our countries, so that we can all prosper.
Yeah, that's critical to remember, right? That even when governments are at odds, it doesn't mean citizens are at war with each other. Often quite the opposite. They can get along quite well, even in intense times. I want to ask you about when we're talking about superpower or major power or great power, competition or cooperation. Looming in the background of this U.S. Russia discussion is China, and you've mentioned them more than once. As you uh, analyze the situation and you think about re-engagement and you write your paper to give advice to your colleagues, how do you factor the China role into the equation? I'm sure you have to think about them, right?
Absolutely. First, Russia has a huge border with China. And Russia and China are the major leading powers, along with India, on the Asian continent, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Of course, now with our competition against Russia over Ukraine, then that what we're seeing is a closer sort of drawing closer of Russia and China. That's not necessarily something good. We know there's mutual suspicions behind this supposed closer friendship, that are based in history, and they're probably stronger than people would like us to think. But still, they have a certain shared interest in pushing back against the United States. Um, the I would say that China, or the People's Republic of China, Communist China, should be of mutual interest to Russia and the US. And that's why China, or the PRC, should be a subject of discussion in the future, if and when we re-engage Russia. Uh, because one of the things I wanted to do in doing my paper was to be honest in my paper, right, is to look at our national security strategy, which every American citizen can look at, and see what it says about China and Russia. And it actually makes a very strong case, if you read it carefully, for China being the greater danger. I mean, China has, maybe danger is a strong word, but I mean, China has basically said by 2050 it intends to overtake the United States in the world. I don't think President Putin has ever said anything like that, and I don't believe President Putin believes Russia could do anything like that. I don't think he has that kind of ambition, but China apparently does under Mr. Xi. So in that case, while Russia and the war in Ukraine may be the closer alligator to the boat and something we really need to focus on now, I think the real concern, maybe for both the US and Russia, are China's global ambitions and what that might mean for our countries. And so I think in that case, that's how I've looked at the People's Republic of China in my paper, as a potential issue on which the US and Russia might want to be talking.
As a final question, Michael, I want to ask you a personal question beyond analysis, beyond your official role at State or your time at the Wilson. Is just this is a dark period, right? And the news from Ukraine every day is horrific. Do you remain optimistic? How do you approach this? And based on your vast experience and your deep dive, what are your thoughts in that regard? Do you have a vision of a future where it's much better than it is today?
I do. And when I was in Vladivostok and in traveling throughout the Russian Far East, from 2016 to 2019, when we still had a consulate open there, um, I frequently told my audiences, both American back home and Russian there in the field, that I was both an optimist and a realist, right? So as a professional diplomat, as a foreign service officer, my government has entrusted me with information and the resources and capabilities to assess wherever I am and to report back honestly what I'm seeing. So I try to give the straight story to my government and provide advice when my government wants advice. That's expected of me. I take that very seriously as a professional, and I do that. So that's the realist in me. I don't think we can afford to be Pollyannish about the world. The world it can be a rough and tumble place, and it's not a particularly friendly time that we're in right now. So I'm going to give my government the best advice I can, and that's part of what this paper is at least providing some lessons learned from the past. I am by nature an optimist, so that means in a way that if I see opportunities, let's seize them. Let's use them. If we see a door opening, let's go through that and see where that can take us. And so I am hopeful that we will get through this period. I don't think any of the countries involved now that we've been discussing here have national suicide on their agenda. I don't think any of us want to do that. So a lot of this is just kind of people are pushing and shoving to see how much they can get. And that's the realist in me says that's kind of the norm of human behavior. Sad to say. But the hopeful and optimistic side of me says that we can figure something out, and that it really ultimately comes down to more communication, not less. And so that's why I've done this paper with the idea of hopefully we can draw some lessons from the past and use those and factor those into however we engage Russia if and when we decide to do that down the road.
Michael Keays, thank you for today, not just for today, but also for a very productive year at the Wilson Center. We've loved having you and wish you luck as you return to state.
Thank you very much.
Our guest has been Michael Keays. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again in the future for another episode. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.